Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Marianne, and thank you also, CODART, for the very nice invitation. It's an honor for me to speak here about Flemish painting and Flemish paintings in the United States in particular, at this Congress here in Antwerp, the city where Rubens and Van Dyck lived and worked for many years, and where they and their contemporaries created many of the works that I am about to show you. Little is known about the earliest history of old master paintings in the United States, but newspaper advertisements and surviving auction catalogs indicate that old masters, including Flemish pictures, were available in limited numbers by the late 18th century. For example, in June of 1786, that is 10 years after the US Declaration of Independence was adopted, a collection of quote-unquote capital and well-chosen old masters was auctioned off by a man named Wijnand van Zandt, at Chorus Tavern in New York. Among the Flemish paintings Van Zandt offered for sale were works by, or presumed to be by, Frans Franken, here called Old Frank, Rubens, Van Dyck, a member of the Teniers family, here called Tenier, and a member of the Breugel family, here called Van Breugel. Unfortunately, not one of these paintings has been identified. It is not known where they came from, who purchased them, or what happened to them after Van Zandt auctioned them off some 237 years ago. Since then, many thousands of old master paintings, including numerous 17th century Flemish works, have arrived on America's shores. Of course, the local supply in America was still very modest in these early days, and many American collectors purchased their old master paintings in Europe, most often in Paris or London. One example of an American who bought paintings abroad early on was Richard Codman, a Boston merchant who was a longtime resident of Paris. In 1796, Codman purchased for $1,800, which was then a very grand sum, 22 paintings and 2 sculptures in one purchase from the well-known Paris dealer Jean-Baptiste Pierre Lebrun. Among those paintings was this work by David Teniers the Younger, who, about this time, was among the most cherished masters of the Flemish school. The painting remained in the Codman family until the late 19th century, and its next owners gave it in 1916 to the Cleveland Museum of Art. The histories of the paintings that crossed the Atlantic over the past centuries have often been impacted by cultural, economic, and political changes. For example, this work by Jan Breugel the Elder, arrived in the United States in 1794 from Antwerp as part of a shipment of 63 paintings that had been taken across the Atlantic by the banker Henri-Joseph Stier d'Aertselaer and his wife, Marie-Louise Peters. The couple, who were both Rubens' descendants, had fled Antwerp to escape the invasion of the French Revolutionary Army. The paintings they took with them had, I think, mostly belonged to Marie-Louise's late father. Her husband, Baron Stier, functioned as the caretaker for the Peters family. In America, the Stiers lived in various places until they built a mansion, plantation house really, named Riversdale, which survives to this day near College Park in Maryland, close to Washington, D.C. There, Baron Stier and his wife kept the Breugel and the other 262 paintings, mostly in crates. Today, most of these works remain unidentified, but I can show you a few of the ones that are known. And one of these is actually in this museum, Rubens' Prodigal Son, and if you're looking for it, it is on display now right by that big moving hand by Christoph Coppens. Several others are now in Brussels, among those Van Dijk's Portrait of a Man, and there's a female pendant as well. Two more Van Dijks, the portraits of Maria de Raad and Philippe Leroy, are in the Wallace collection in London. And this work, Cimon and Pero, or the Caritas Romana, is in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where it is attributed to Rubens's workshop. And one painting, Romulus and Remus, is in a private collection in the United States. The Stiers stayed in the United States for 9 years, until 1803, when they felt it was safe to return to Antwerp. At the time, they left their paintings in the care of their youngest daughter, Rosalie, who had married an American and who would remain in the United States. In 1816, she returned the paintings to her parents in Antwerp. Notably, a few years later, Rosalie's brother suggested to her American husband the possibility to sell the collection to the United States so that it could become the nucleus of a national gallery there. Obviously, that did not happen, and instead, in 1822, the works were auctioned off here in Antwerp and then dispersed. After this sale, one painting, the Romulus and Remus, crossed the Atlantic once again to return to Riversdale. Since then, it has descended in the family. And some years ago, the family lent it to the North Carolina Museum of Art, where it can now be seen in their Kunstkamer. And it is flanked there by other Flemish paintings. On the right, a Holy Family with Saint Anne, and on the left, a bear hunt, now both given to Rubens and his workshop. De Breugel followed a different path. After it was auctioned off in Antwerp in 1822, it passed through several private collections in Europe. Nevertheless, in 1977, that is more than a century and a half after it had left the United States, it returned there after it was bought by the real estate developer Bob Smith, who would go on to become a trustee and then president of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. In 1992, Smith sold De Breugel, which was then acquired by the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Another notable refugee was Joseph Bonaparte, the deposed king of Naples and Spain, who had fled to the United States after his younger brother, Napoleon, was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. And while Joseph was in power, he had amassed a magnificent art collection, and more than 200 of his paintings followed him to America, among those a large number of Flemish ones. Unfortunately, the fascinating story of Joseph Bonaparte in America will have to remain untold here, but among the paintings that he brought with him was, for example, this very large stag hunt, then attributed to Frans Snijders and now to Paul de Vos. When Joseph Bonaparte temporarily returned to Europe in 1832, he took several paintings back with him. And among these was this work, the Caravaggesque Jupiter and Mercury visiting Philemon and Baucis by Abraham Janssens. It remained in Europe for more than a century. However, it crossed the Atlantic once again in 1948, after it was sold in London, notably as by Caravaggio. 6 years later, in 1954, it entered the Davis Museum at Wellesley College, as by Janssens. Of course, the collections that were brought over by the Stieren-D'Artselaars and by Joseph Bonaparte cannot be considered quote-unquote American collections. The man who is often seen as the first major American collector of old masters was a close contemporary of Joseph Bonaparte, Robert Gilmore Jr., a rich shipping merchant from Baltimore, who was exceptionally well-traveled in Europe. Gilmore was the leading promoter of American art, and he believed that an American school of painting would emerge out of Europe's artistic traditions, and that, therefore, old master pictures should be available for study for artists in the United States. Gilmore owned some 60 paintings that he thought to be 17th century Flemish. Today, most of these, but not all, remain unidentified. One painting that entered Gilmore's collection is the large stag hunt earlier with Joseph Bonaparte, who, in fact, had given it to a nephew as a wedding present. The nephew then sold it to Gilmore, and it is now at the Ringling in Sarasota in Florida. Gilmore's collection included several works by or attributed to Rubens and Van Dyck. For example, in the 1820s, he bought these two pendants in the United States, in Philadelphia. At the time, they were attributed to Van Dyck and said to represent Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. After Gilmore sold them, they returned to Europe, where they were soon split up. The man ended up in Göteborg in Sweden and is now given to Caspar de Kraaier. The woman was last offered for sale last September in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So it tells you how these paintings travel. And in Sao Paulo, it was attributed to Van Dyck, wishful thinking. I heard the woman was bought in. Unfortunately, Göteborg is not interested in reuniting the pair. So if you're interested, I think once she's clean, it's probably a nice painting. The last work from Gilmore's collection that I want to show you is this Teniers. Gilmore bought it in New York in 1823 from the painter and dealer John Trumbull. And Trumbull himself had bought it in Paris in the late 1790s, not long after the French Revolution. He told Gilmore that at that time, quote unquote, the dead man's head reminded everyone so thoroughly of the guillotine as to render the picture with all its merits unpopular and unsaleable. By the end of his life, Gilmore had lost most of his fortune. He offered his paintings to the then fledgling Smithsonian Institution in Washington to serve as the nucleus of a national museum, but the Smithsonian was not interested, and as a result, Gilmore's paintings were dispersed. The Teniers came into the hands of a nephew who sold it to a man named Gouverneur Campbell, an industrialist from New York. And in 1872, Campbell gave it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which had then just been established in New York 2 years earlier in 1870. And that is the same year as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And here is the Met's first location, the Dodworth Building, which was a former dancing academy. The Teniers was not the first Flemish painting to enter the Met. The Met's founding collection, the so-called Purchase of 1871, included many Flemish paintings. And, And one reason for their presence lies in the fact that the mastermind behind the Met's purchase of 1871 was a Flemish-born dealer, Léon Gaucher, a name that may sound familiar to some of you. Gaucher, who was mainly based in Paris, was a highly influential figure who was involved with many museums, and among these, most prominently, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels. But Gaucher was also a familiar figure here in Antwerp, and it was, in fact, Gaucher who in 1894 would sell Rubens's Prodigal Son, earlier in the United States with the Stier Daartselaars, to this museum. But back to the Met's purchase of 1871, which included a total of 174 paintings. Here you see several of the Flemish works that remain at the Met to this day. On the left, Van Dyck's Saint Rosalie, which he painted in 1624 when he was in Palermo, stuck in Palermo because of the plague. In the center, a work by Abraham Breugel, which entered the Met as by Velázquez, and on the right, a Cornelis de Vos portrait of a young woman. However, over the years, the Met would deaccession I think about 120 works from the purchase of 1871, that is about 2/3. And among these was this altarpiece, The Return of the Holy Family from Jerusalem, which was originally painted for a side chapel of the Church of St. Charles Borromeus here in Antwerp. In 1980, and then again in 1981, it was offered for sale as by School of Rubens. And in 1981, it sold just for a low $7,000. In 2011, it was purchased and returned to the church, where it can now again be seen in its restored glory. And on the right is the painting as it looked a few days ago. And here you see it back where it is. With the founding of the Met in New York and the MFA in Boston in 1870, we have entered America's so-called Gilded Age, the decades of great wealth that preceded the First World War. And you may be familiar with this cartoon, which was published in 1911. It shows one of America's legendary collectors, the financier J. Pierpont Morgan, towering over New York City while holding a large dollar-shaped magnet and thus pulling Europe's art treasures across the Atlantic. And on the right, you see two paintings that look somewhat Flemish. Another great collector of America's Gilded Age was Henry Marquand, also a New Yorker. In 1886, he bought for a very steep $40,000 the painting that many of his contemporaries considered the highlight among his old masters, this grand portrait of James Stewart by Van Dyck. Admittedly, about this time, Americans collected Van Dyck not necessarily as a Flemish master. Rather, he was often considered and collected as the head of the English school, and Adam Aker, who is here, has written about this. And one of the Met's recent Flemish acquisitions is also an English Van Dyck, Queen Henrietta Maria. In 1889, Henry Marquand donated a group of 37 old master paintings to the Met. They included his Van Dyck, which you can see here on the back wall in this later image. And on a side note, I should add that Marquand's gift also included his Vermeer, the young woman with the water pitcher, probably the first Vermeer to come to the United States. And to be honest, it did not make much of an impression on most critics or on the public when it was first exhibited at the Met, but that would soon change, and it is now one of the Met's great treasures. You will need to travel to New York to see it because it is not included in the exhibition at the Rijksmuseum. At any rate, it was Marquand's wish that the American public benefit from his gift to the Met for years to come. At the same time, however, his gift was explicitly meant to serve as an example for his collecting peers. And in a sense, many of America's well-known collectors have indeed followed in Marquand's footsteps. Of course, each did so in their own way, and I can only refer very briefly to a handful of these collectors here, all of whom included Flemish paintings in their collections. One notable figure was Isabella Stewart Gardner of Boston, founder of the Isabella Gardner Museum there. Early on, she bought this Italianate portrait by Rubens of the Earl of Arundel upon the advice of Bernard Berenson. Two other prominent collectors of Flemish painting were the transit tycoon Peter A.B. Widener, here on the left, and his friend and lawyer John Graver Johnson, both from Philadelphia. As collectors, the two were opposites. Widener went mostly for big paintings by big names, and some of you will be familiar with the rather spectacular story behind Widener's purchase in 1908, of three of Van Dyck's Cataneo portraits, and here you see the Marchesa Cataneo. And this episode became known as the exhaust pipe plot because when these three canvases were smuggled out of Italy, they were rolled up and hidden inside the tubing of an extra long car. Widener's son Joseph donated these three Van Dycks and many other works to the National Gallery of Art in 1942. Widener's friend Johnson, by contrast, collected much more voraciously, as you can see here. He also bought works by lesser-known artists and of varying quality. His collection is now in is under stewardship of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And here you see a few of his better-known paintings, and the Rombouts is now on view in Ghent as part of the exhibition on Rombouts there. Then there is the steel tycoon Henry Clay Frick of Pittsburgh and New York, the founder of the Frick collection, and this is a posthumous portrait of him. Frick owned several Van Dycks, among these portraits of Frans Snijders and his wife, Margaretha de Vos, which were reunited when Frick bought them from their respective British owners. Another noteworthy collector of Flemish paintings was Frick's close friend Andrew Mellon, the banker and politician from Pittsburgh, who founded the National Gallery of Art in Washington. In 1931, Mellon was able to secretly purchase a group of 21 masterpiece paintings from the Hermitage in what was then Leningrad. Remarkably, Mellon was also serving as Secretary of the US Treasury at the time, and this is another story that would require much more time. Among Mellon's Hermitage purchases were these three works by Van Dyck. Interestingly, two of them, Isabella Brandt and Susanna Froment and her daughter, were purchased as by Rubens. And of course, just to name one more, there's J. Paul Getty, the oil tycoon, who founded the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Getty loved Rubens especially, and Anne Willett, who's also here, has written extensively on that topic. The Getty Museum has continued to buy Rubens, as you see here. In our own day, private collectors as well as museums in the United States continue to collect Flemish paintings. And luckily, many private collectors continue to make remarkable donations to museums. One example that comes to mind here is the grand promise gift that the Van Otterloos and the Weatherbys made to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston a few years ago. It is the largest gift of European paintings in the MFA's history, and while its focus is on Dutch art, it also includes a number of Flemish paintings. Among these are, for example, this still life by Ozias Beert from the Weatherby collection, and Rubens's dramatic crucifixion from the Van Otterloo collection. Flemish paintings still keep coming to light, and among the recent discoveries is a series of 5 paintings of the 5 senses by Michelina Woutier. After they surfaced, I think in 2020, the works were acquired by the Van Otterloos, and they are currently on view at the MFA. My time is up, but fortunately, the story of Flemish painting in America continues. Thank you.